The President of the United States opened his remarks by reflecting on the state of US-China relations in a broad sense, acknowledging competitive dynamics while stressing the importance of cooperation and mutual respect. He said that although intelligence agencies have raised alarm about Chinese intrusion into parts of the American power grid, water systems, theft of intellectual property, and purchases of American farmland, the tone of his response emphasized a strategic posture rather than an overtly adversarial one. He observed, "It's like everybody else. We're a threat to them, to many of the things that you say we do to them." He went on, "Look, this is a very competitive world, especially when it comes to China and the US. And we're always watching them, and they're always watching us," he concluded. "In the meantime, I think we get along very well. And I think we can be bigger, better, and stronger by working with them as opposed to just knocking them out." The clear message: the relationship is not defined solely by confrontation. The president argued that working with China offers a path to advance US interests rather than simply seeking to block Beijing at every turn. In a subsequent segment, the White House correspondent framed the US-China relationship in operational terms, pointing to two key areas where potential friction could occur: Taiwan and semiconductor chips. The correspondent reported that following a recent face-to-face meeting between President Trump and President Xi in South Korea, the US leader offered praise for his Chinese counterpart, saying the relationship between the two countries was good. She noted that a one-year trade deal had been concluded, relieving some tariff pressure and offering value to American soybean farmers who had faced lagging Chinese purchases this season. On Taiwan, the correspondent said she raised the long-standing difficulty in US-China ties. She reported that the president told her it didn't even come up at all in the meeting. Previously, US officials have consistently flagged Taiwan as a quintessential source of disagreement, especially as Beijing refuses to forego claims to the island and Washington encourages Taipei's defense. In the transcript, the president went a step further, saying it's really not an issue and it's much closer to China than it is with the US. That remark echoes previous lines from the president when discussing Europe or other contested areas, where he has positioned the US somewhat detached from contested ground, suggesting a pragmatic rather than ideological posture. The second pressure point, semiconductors. The correspondent pointed out that the president said China had been asking for chips from NVIDIA, but that the US held 40 or 50% of the chip market, and that share is set to grow over the next several years, granting the US an edge in the artificial intelligence race. She emphasized this is a space to watch closely as tension between the US and China could intensify. A sharper shift emerged in reporting a remark from the president hours before his meeting with President Xi. The US was planning to resume testing nuclear weapons. When asked, "Are you saying that after more than 30 years, the United States is going to start detonating nuclear weapons?" the president responded, "I'm saying that we're going to test nuclear weapons like other countries do." Yes, when pressed further on whether only Russia and China were testing weapons, he stated, "Russia is testing nuclear and China is testing them too. You just don't know about it." The correspondent noted that China has denied testing nuclear weapons and that there is no publicly verified record of a Chinese nuclear weapons detonation since 1996. Meanwhile, she turned to the US Energy Secretary, who clarified that the US tests would not involve nuclear explosions in the traditional sense. The Energy Secretary was quoted saying, "I think the tests we're talking about right now are system tests. These are not nuclear explosions, what we call non-critical explosions." According to him, the focus is on verifying the delivery components and geometry of the weapons system rather than detonating a warhead. Experts interviewed said this indicates a reinterpretation of the president's announcement. While the rhetoric indicated a return to Cold War-style testing, the technical reality is closer to modern subcritical tests or system validation. As one analysis put it, the US plans to restart nuclear testing, but the tests likely won't produce any mushroom clouds. Taken together, the remarks and background indicate the following contours of US policy toward China. The administration is continuing to emphasize competition, but is calibrating public rhetoric toward cooperation where feasible on trade and agriculture. The one-year deal and tariff relief for US farmers sends a signal of economic linkage rather than severance. On Taiwan and the chip race, the US signals alertness to core strategic issues, but also a willingness to compartmentalize or deprioritize them in a given summit context. On nuclear weapons, the president's bold verbal posture has been tempered by the technical clarification the US is not returning to large-scale nuclear detonations, but is prioritizing weapon system readiness tests. The White House's messaging suggests a dual-track strategy, maintaining strategic deterrence while avoiding unintended escalation. On the one hand, the president's remarks about China reflect a recognition of competition in power, technology, and influence. His reference to "we're always watching them and they're always watching us" underscores an adversarial baseline, yet his call that we get along very well and that we can be bigger, better, and stronger by working with them signals a transactional or pragmatic approach. This dual tone may reflect US intent to avoid an open Cold War-style confrontation while still positioning Beijing as a strategic rival. The trade deal and relief to American farmers suggests the administration is attempting to strike a balance, respond to pressure from US constituencies like soybean farmers, and demonstrate economic engagement even as it frames China as a challenge rather than a partner. Meanwhile, the Taiwan and chip segments highlight where the competition is sharper. A lack of mention of Taiwan at the summit may suggest either a deliberate omission to keep summit optics calm or a change in priority, though the long-standing US support for Taiwan's self-defense remains a potential red line for Beijing. On nuclear weapons, the president's public posture arguably serves two audiences: domestic, showing strength and readiness, and international rivals, sending a signal, but the technical clarifications mean the risk of dramatic escalatory moves, mushroom clouds, massive tests, is lower than headlines may suggest. Still, any US signaling of resumed testing prompts concern among arms control observers. Even simulation or system tests can affect the global nuclear balance and perceptions of escalation. For China, President Xi's third term consolidates his leadership further, and his messaging in recent military displays has emphasized a choice between peace or war. Beijing's official denial of testing nuclear weapons and its call on Washington to maintain the moratorium stands in direct tension with the US narrative. Looking ahead, several variables will shape the US-China dynamic: semiconductors and AI. The US claims an edge in chips and AI. Beijing is pushing to close the gap. The strategic value of these technologies means this arena will remain high stakes Taiwan and military posture. Even if Taiwan did not figure in the recent summit, any military moves by Beijing or US Taiwan responses could reignite tensions. Trade and economic linkages, whether the one-year deal expands into longer-term frameworks or whether tariffs return, will influence the degree to which economic competition remains stable or becomes volatile. Nuclear testing and deterrence. While the US says it is not restarting detonations, the signal of testing may prompt ripples in global arms dynamics. How Russia and China respond will matter for strategic stability. Summit diplomacy versus reality. High-profile meetings produce headlines, but the underlying strategic competition remains complex. The recent US-China meeting may have produced calm optics, but systemic rivalry remains. In effect, the White House has delivered a message. Yes, the US sees China as a competitor in multiple theaters: economic, technological, military, but prefers to engage where possible rather than default to confrontation. The president's rhetoric on nuclear testing grabbed attention, though the actual plan appears more modest than the headlines suggested. At the same time, President Xi remains firmly in control of China's strategic direction, and Beijing is signaling that it wants a different global order, one less dominated by the United States. For observers of international security, trade and technology policy, the unfolding US-China relationship thus remains one of the most consequential axes. The summit may offer short-term respite from confrontation, but the structural competition is unlikely to disappear. The coming months will test whether the balance can be maintained or whether new flashpoints emerge.